So the culture around this overconsumption of fashion, um, and the companies that are meeting this demand, was there an awareness as these things started to sort of align and escalate the impact of this on the environment? Did folks know this and they chose to ignore it? Or is it one of those
I think
unfortunate occurrences?
I think a lot of people didn't quite realize. We're now much more aware of some of the chemicals that we use, or the impacts that we have. Some must have known, in the sense of dyeing. There's a reason why dyeing does not happen in a lot of first world countries. It tends to happen in poorer parts of the world where environmental regulations are lower, because there's a lot of pollution. The fact that at one point you could tell what the up and coming season's clothing colors were going to be from the color of rivers in parts of China, tells you that someone, if they were ignorant, they were somewhat willfully ignorant. But also, a lot of clothing companies and designers are actually quite divorced from their supply chain as well. A lot of people buy finished garments. They're not involved in tier 4, tier 3, often not even in tier 2 of their supply chain. They're only dealing with the finished goods suppliers and buying finished goods. So
can you say a little bit more about that? So you're saying Macy's, for example, a department store, is not involved in the actual designing and assembling of these garments. They're just selecting from a slate of items and purchasing it for their customers?
Somewhat, yes. I mean, most fashion brands are exactly that. They are brands, and they are marketing and sales companies. Not all of them are as involved in design as people think. But equally, let's go further back. How many brands actually ever go and see where their cotton comes from, where it's grown? How many designers do you know who've been to a cotton field, right? Especially in different parts of the world. I mean, we talk here, it's a lot of people who designers. How many of you have been to a polyester mill? You know what I mean? Like, who here has been to a dye house? Because these are parts of the supply chain that you don't normally touch. You just ask for it in a color, and it comes in a color. You know what I mean? So it makes it, when you are that divorced from your supply chain, you sometimes can miss a lot of things. But we are also learning a lot more about how damaging fashion actually is. And it's becoming more and more of a topic for discussion.
And who's been the impetus for signaling that issue and heightening our awareness around this? Was there a moment?
So there have been a few notable groups who've helped escalate this. And it's funny, I in a lot of ways, I talk about the Ellen MacArthur report that came out at the end of 2017. They did a whole thing, and it's one of the most quoted studies on, the impact of fashion and textiles. They did a whole project with Qantas, which is a consultancy that was doing a lot of the calculations. That was probably the turning point for a lot of people. I mean, there've been people who've been thinking about sustainable fashion for 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, if you think of Patagonia, everyone's now trumpeting the fact that they're using recycled plastic bottles as their source of polyester plastic, right? But, Patagonia released their first rPET fleece in the 1990s. So I think it was 1991. And so, some people were a lot more ahead of the times. But now it's become something, I think we have definitely felt the impact and the transition from like probably 2016 until now is probably how it's been building, which is not a lot of time if you think about it.
So I'm one of those people who, for the most part, exclusively shops at a thrift store, feeling like I am doing my part to support the circular economy and keeping dollars within our local economy, and also recycling the items that I no longer have interest in and returning them back to a thrift store with this idea or notion that it's all being circulated. But I think there's some big misconceptions about these so-called recycling outlets and how they too are contributing to this larger issue. Can you speak to that?
So there are definitely some misconceptions there. I think buying things from thrift stores is one of the best things you can do. Keeping clothes, you know, if you want to do something now as an individual, treating your clothes well so that they last longer, buying carefully so that you buy more durable clothing, and also just keeping things in circulation for longer is one of the best things, absolutely best things you can do. And, you know, so to the extent that you can give clothes a continued life so that they're not going for disposal, that is great. What generally happens is most people think, okay, I'll go and give it to Goodwill and then I'm doing good, right?
Yep.
And
me, I'm that person.
which is actually, I mean, please don't stop giving things to Goodwill. That's not what I'm saying. But, you know, maybe 20% of what they get donated actually is able to be resold. And then the other 80% gets basically packaged up. And then there's a whole industry of people who sort and grade it. And then it goes through the supply chain. And generally what happens is it gets bundled up, loaded into a container, and then a container will be shipped to somewhere like Ghana or India or different parts of the world. And then what happens is the people on that side will hope that they get 40% of the material of the clothes in there as being saleable. And then they're left with 60% of it that's waste that they have to dispose of. So it just gets dumped in a pile, basically.
In a big landfill with everything else?
Yeah. And actually in the US, you've got about 13 million tons that goes to landfill or incineration every year. So that's excluding the stuff that is going into like the secondhand markets or trying to be channeled. There's also, you know, the stuff that's just being burnt or buried here in the US. So it is a massive problem, like massive problem. So I don't want to make you feel bad for donating to Goodwill. Please do keep doing it. But before you donate your clothes, ideally, like, best is to keep it in circulation for as long as possible. And if you're donating your clothes, you know, try and set up a bit of a swap group with friends that you know or things like that. It's because then you know it's going directly to someone who will use it again and keep it in circulation for longer.
What does a future look like if we do nothing with this issue?
I don't think we can. Fundamentally, well, one, I think there's enough impetus that something will be done. Here it is and if nothing gets done voluntarily, it will be regulated. If you look at what's happening in Europe, Europe is banning the landfilling of textiles by 2025. They're just
because the issue is that dire that the government has got to intervene.
I heard a policy person speaking yesterday, and they said brands were given the opportunity to fix the problem themselves, and they didn't. So now it's getting regulated. So this is happening, and it's not just Europe. I mean, Massachusetts just did this as well. They just banned people throwing clothes into their garbage. You're not allowed to actually just curbside, you know, throw away mattresses anymore. These sorts of things. There are a lot of things coming which are going to force people to change, because if we don't change, this is the fastest growing area of landfill by volume. And unfortunately, clothing tends to have a lot of dyes and finishing chemistries that you don't necessarily want leaking into the environment, and has been leaking for a long period of time.
Can you speak a little bit more to some of that? I mean, I think we know that this is an issue, but I don't know if we know concretely to the extent the impact on one's day-to-day lived experience in a place like the United States. Like what would that look like if we did not another intervention, companies like Circ didn't exist trying to tackle this problem? Would we all just sort of like fall under a pile of textiles?
Well, what will happen is you'll basically get more and more landfills. And then you'll get more and more ultimately groundwater pollution, because as these clothes start to degrade, they're going to release chemicals that you don't want in the groundwater. When we first started, we thought we'd start with something simple. We took a plain white cotton t-shirt and we ran that through our process. And then we sent the water from our process off for testing to see what else had come off there. And we nearly had heart failure because we saw the amount of lead in the water. And we went and frantically started testing our local water because we thought there was lead in the water that we were putting into the system. And out that water was clean. So what was lead doing on a plain white t-shirt? It's because cotton is not white. Remember, cotton is not actually white as a fabric. So it's dyed white. And there's actually a lot of dye that goes into dyeing things white. And in this case, they were using lead-based mordants in the dye and binding that to the clothes. I mean, one of the things that I have learned, very strongly from now being in this industry is I will never wear anything that I haven't washed first, at least once.
Do y'all hear that? This is some good wisdom here.
Hey, there's too much that's put on to make, like, when you see a garment in a store, it's often been like, has additional chemistry on it to make it look good in a store.
Wow.
These are things to consider. So
it's like the shiny apples in the grocery store. Like, apples aren't that shiny, y'all.
Yeah. Most oranges are not that orange. It's really funny. I once picked up a bag of organic oranges and I read the ingredient label and it was like oranges and colorants and beeswax.
Wow.
So someone had dyed those oranges and then coated them in beeswax. So, I mean, I think sadly, this isn't where we'll see the big impacts. In places where this stuff ultimately gets dumped, which is in places like Kantamonto market in Accra in Ghana, there you can already see the effects and how bad it is.
So tell us about Circ and this particular type of technology.
That's automatic. Those types of areas, we've stopped exporting a lot of our pollution, but we still do.
I think this would be a great time to sort of segue and talk about your company, Circ, and the specific type of technology that you all are employing to support this more circular recycling of textiles.
So that is yes. Now, after all of that doom and gloom, let me give you some hope.
Some solutions.
So what we developed is we found a way where we could separate polyester from cotton. So we deal with polycotton blends, which is the biggest waste stream that's out there in textiles. And the challenge that we have is that, and this is where it comes down to design, is when you start to combine materials together, you make them infinitely more difficult to recycle. So we developed a way where we could dissolve the polyester. So we actually break it down. So when if I held up a polycotton t-shirt, for example, the polyester disappears and you're left with the cotton, but it's a cotton skeleton, as we call it. So the polyester breaks down, goes into the liquid, and then we recover the chemicals that make up the polyester from that liquid. We purify them and we can make it back into polyester. So essentially, we're getting out those building blocks and rebuilding it. And then you can make new polyester fiber. On the cellulosic side, or on the cotton side, cotton tends to get weakened through the process, but we do this in benign enough conditions that we can preserve the underlying cellulose that's inside the cotton. And that cellulose we use to make lyocell, or, well, we focus on lyocell, but we could make viscose or modal or cupro, one of those. And this is actually one of the most fascinating things we learned, was how few people realize what's in their clothes. Because when I'm like, oh, I can provide tree-free clothing for you, and people are like, what? I have trees in my clothes, you know?
Yeah.
But this is actually a key thing. Cotton is a very pure form of cellulose, so we can use that to replace trees when making, as a feedstock when making lyocell. So polyester broken down, rebuilt into new polyester, and the cotton taken to make pulp, which goes into making lyocell.
And that is, so repurposing those fibers to make more textiles though.
Yes. So we're basically taking those both back into the textile supply chain. And so that's where the circularity component comes in, is that now you're going from textile to textile. And that's, you know, it is a bit of a subtle point, because, you know, the most commonly you're using polyester bottles, for example. But when you take a polyester bottle and you melt it down to extrude to make polyester, you know, that soda bottle then is trapped in clothing as polycotton, and then it's going to landfill or incineration. So it's much better if the bottle could go bottle to bottle to bottle,
Right.
rather than bottle to textiles to landfill.
Right.
So
Right.
we allow that to be untrapped, and that's pretty, you know, that's what we're doing. That's pretty revolutionary.
And with your technology, as you continue to circulate these fibers, are you able to perpetually do that? Like that new fiber that results from that process that's formed into an article of clothing that then could be brought back to you and go through the process again into indefinitely?
So on the polyester side, I would say yes, because polyester is much easier to rebuild. Your natural materials will degrade over time. And so what you'll do is, it's like recycling paper. You recycle paper only so many times until you've got basically a mush. And then you're using that mush maybe to make, you know, your egg cartons or things like that. But you're not going to, you know, once it goes past egg carton, it's probably going. But the nice thing with those cellulosic materials is they will then, especially if you have not put loads of chemicals on them, they will naturally degrade. So in the environment. So infinite recyclability of man-made cellulosics, no. Recyclability of your synthetics, you like your polyesters,
Yeah.
much more easy to do.
And for a company like Circ, you know, of the 92 million tons of textiles that's wasted every year, what percentage of that are you able to tackle with your company at the scale that you operate now?
At the scale we operate now, 0.00001%, because we're still at pilot stage. You know, we do, you know, if we were running just for pure production as opposed to engineering development work, we could do about 4 to 5 tons per day. So, you know, when you put that against 92 million tons, it gets pretty scary pretty quickly. And in fact, you're looking, remember, not all of that is polycotton either. So we can handle the polycotton blends. That's maybe 45 million of that, tons of that, right? But we need to complete all the engineering work so we can build a full-scale facility. But even that full-scale facility, you know, you're putting down one, it's going to do like 70,000 tons a year. The nice thing is, once you've got one and it's operating and it's running smoothly, it's much easier to then copy and paste them around the world and also build bigger ones, because you want to build them as big as possible to basically just transform this industry as fast as possible. The other thing to remember, and it's something that most people don't realize about the textile waste, is that everyone talks about post-consumer waste because it's, you know, it's the one that everyone sees in a way and touches. But we actually deal with 3 main textile waste streams. There's the post-industrial waste, of which there is a mountain of that stuff. And it's a much easier source for people to process as a first stage because it's a much cleaner waste stream. So in recycling, any recycling technology, the more clean your waste stream is, the easier it is to recycle, and the better it is, the lower risk. So what we do, what we can do is we can address all of that waste. And if you think about like just on a cutting room floor, you may be losing 15% of the material.
Mhm.
But if you go through the entire supply chain, you're losing 45, 50% of the material. So that means for every item of clothing that you have, there's an equal amount of supply chain waste along the way. So if we can process that, we're already cleaning up a massive problem.
Mhm.
Then, sadly, we get to the industry's dirty secret, and that is the other main mountain of waste is actually pre-consumer clothing. And so this is clothing that is unsold inventory that never touches human hands and needs to be disposed of. Because if you get a 40% full price sell through, you're like, yes, right? What happens to the other 60% of clothing? Right? What
Wow.
happens if you ordered something and it's the wrong color for the season? What happens if you have a misprint? We had a brand approach us. They were like, we accidentally misprinted 500,000 t-shirts. Can you please dispose of these for us?
Wow.
500,000, right? You think about when COVID hit, right? The collared shirt died. Other than Rob and I, no one still wears them. So you end up with a situation where there was masses of volume of like men's shirts that just went nowhere, and they had to dispose of them. They had container loads of the stuff. And so we'd get these calls on a weekly basis like, hey, can you take this? Can you do something with it? We're like, we're not at that scale yet. But I could fill facilities with just pre-consumer waste. And then you get to post-consumer, right? And the problem is post-consumer is your most contaminated waste stream. If you all took all the clothes you were wearing, how many materials do you think you've got on, right? It's not just polyester and cotton. It's, who on this call has something that they're wearing with spandex in it, right? Who on the call has something that's got lyocell or viscose, nylon?
Mhm.
Anyone got any acrylics there? Wool, right? Leather. So when someone throws everything in the bucket, it's like really difficult because you've got to figure out how to separate and sort that. And there are technologies being developed to automate and make those simpler, but they're not there yet.
Mhm.
So it's important for people to understand, like, if we push too much for perfect, we end up making the solutions more difficult to actually come to market and come to scale.
Mhm.
We get the same issue with brands who come to us with what we call tight loop requests instead of closed loop requests, where they're like, hey, can you take these t-shirts, Vows, recycle them, and then can we have the fiber to make those t-shirts again? And I'm like, sure. So what you're trying to tell me is I must use your material, recycle your material for you, as opposed to just taking everyone's waste and then just apportioning out some, right? So, we're like, the equivalent would be if you went to a bank, you deposited some cash, and you're like, in 10 years' time, I'm going to want that same dollar back. You could set aside that dollar, but then the money's not moving and circulating, and it's going to be insanely expensive.
So I gotta say, I'm feeling really daunted right now by all that is being shared and revealed to me that I had no idea about. But yet you have this like brilliant smile, Luke. How do you maintain like your optimism for what seems completely unsolvable? And that we're not at a place where we have the regulations and the policy isn't quite there, but the waste continues to pile up and pile up.
I see the speed at which things are starting to change. I feel the momentum and the wave of support that we're getting. I see, you know, I'm sitting here at Textile Exchange. I'm, you know, and I'm talking to some of my peers. I've seen a radical shift in this industry in 4 years. You know, especially if you're trying to transform, you know, multi-thousand-year-old industry. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
the Industrial Revolution was based on industrialization of textile production. So we're talking about fixing something that goes all the way back to the, you know, 1800s. But what we are finding is that finally, there's growing and growing and growing support. There are resources being put towards this. The regulation is changing. And so that does give me hope. That does give me optimism and allows me to feel better about this. Do we need to move fast? Yes. But we are doing these are major industrial facilities that we're going to have to build to recycle this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to take time. And so I have to be patient. And so now I find things that I can do in my day-to-day life and encourage others to do, to just be less wasteful and more careful
Mm-hmm.
while the solutions are coming. But I finally feel like the solutions are coming.
We're gonna ride on your optimism. We're gonna ride on your optimism.
So, you know, I reiterate, do make changes in small ways, build up your own, improve your own sustainability profile in all aspects of your life,
Yeah.
right? Is what I encourage everyone to do. But know that there are people working and getting support now to bring in solutions that will help us fight climate change and the pollution that we've been generating.
What can the folks on this call, you know, aside from some of the tips that you gave us with regards to holding on to our items more, caring for our things, being more selective about the items that we're bringing into our homes, this idea of being less wasteful, more careful, what other things can we be doing to advance progress in this effort?
You know, we've just had an election in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And I made this comment: vote green, not blue or red. Vote green. Because, you know, it doesn't matter who's in power, you know, you know, if the ship's sunk. It doesn't matter who's the captain, but if the ship's underwater, it's underwater.
Mm-hmm.
So you want someone who's going to keep us afloat. So it doesn't, for me, in a lot of ways, that is the issue. That is the thing that, you know, trumps all other issues for me, in terms of, like, you want people who are going to drive some of these supporting policies forward. Because if you think about, like, if you see what happens what's happening in Europe, the US needs to catch up in terms of some of these policies. It can't be selective. It can't be showing up in Massachusetts, in California, and then be actively rejected in other parts of the country.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so
I've got one last question before we segue into opening it up for Q&A with folks on the call. So for those of you that are with us, think about a question that you may want to ask, and we'll just ask for you to unmute yourself and ask Luke directly. You mentioned earlier in our conversation, after learning about sort of like the chemical composition of clothing, that now you yourself, you know, have a tendency to wash your garments first. Are there other things that you've learned in doing this work that have changed some of your day-to-day practices? Some additional things?
So the other thing I do is I'm much more careful about what I buy online. And the reason why I say this is because most people don't realize that generally when items get returned, they actually go into that pre-consumer waste pile.
Mm-hmm.
It is often more expensive to restock an item than to throw it away. And so there are a lot of products that we order to test out different things.
Mhm.
You know, I was guilty of this with like, you know, as much as possible, if you know your shoe size, get your shoe size. And hopefully the size curve that they give you online is correct, because when you're shipping pairs of shoes back, you know, maybe shoes get restocked, but like a lot of items don't get restocked. The big issue that that you may have seen this occasionally with low value products on like Amazon or Shein or you know, any of these, where they're like, you go to return something and they're like, they just refund you and don't want the item back.
Yeah.
Because if they take the item back, they got to worry about what they do with it. So just be mindful and more cautious in the way you buy so that you have to return less.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other changes that you found yourself making as you become more aware and informed?
Unrelated to fashion,
Yeah.
because I now play a lot more in the sustainability space and I'm unfortunately exposed to a lot more things,
Yeah.
I now much more careful about filtering my drinking water, because I realized that a lot of municipal water systems are not actually designed to filter out everything they need to filter out. So,
But he's still smiling, folks. He's still smiling. Remember that.
I'm still smiling. And not just because I'm a naturally very happy person, it's because I truly believe we can build a better world.
Yeah.
And people are waking up to that and are doing it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'd love to open it up to the group here. We've got a nice intimate group. So if there are any folks that have a question, feel free to come off mute. Oh, here we go, Rob. Go ahead.
Thanks, Heather. Super interesting. The first thing I would say is, like, as someone who doesn't consider himself like a fashion plate, but I think, as you said, like, what you wear is kind of your personal brand. I mean, we all want to look presentable and feel good, and clothes is one way to do that. But I was also thinking about like how, and this may be a generational thing too, but when I used to think about buying clothes, it was, you're buying things that are well made, that can last. Like, I have jackets that are 20 years old that I still wear, and it's because it was a quality coat. And we've always had trends, and fashion's always been kind of a thing, but it also seems like that there's been this shift where kind of the fast fashion, like, how long has this been going on? Like, have I just totally missed this thing where, like, you're no longer shopping with the intention that something should last?
So let me give you a concrete, a classic example from the US specifically, right? What did you wear? What did you wear for Halloween? What did your kids wear for Halloween? Right? And
Not a sheet with 2 holes cut out with the eyes.
And so how many times are you likely to rewear the same Halloween costume? It's not just clothing. How many of you have holiday cushions, right? Holiday decorations that are textile based, right? You have your Thanksgiving stuff, you have your Christmas stuff, you have all of these things that you buy, and then you're like, oh, now I need new decorations for this or new decorations for that, right? There are a lot more items that we consume far more than we used to. And you know, you go and you buy that stuff, and it's like, you buy a 4th of July flag to wave, and it's like that thing is such low quality that it's like, you know, by the 5th of July it needs to be thrown away. you know, and you're just going to buy another one the next year. So, but you're right. There used to be a lot more focus on buying quality items, but the price point difference has become so great between a quality coat and one. You can pick up a coat on Shein for $25 a coat. You can maybe buy a t-shirt for like $4, $5, $6, $8, right? It's not a, yeah, anyway. So I take your point. It is partially generational, but it is also a factor of we have all been trained to consume more.
Anne, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I'm old. I'm part of Rob's generation. I hardly ever buy anything, but I really appreciate Luke, you're giving us hope. And when I now think about buying things, I always think, well, I should buy natural fibers because that's better somehow for the environment. But when I hear you talking about what's recyclable, oh my gosh, maybe we should all dress in polyester all the time. Or maybe there's a transitional period where we move from let's use natural fibers to it's actually scaled up, because I totally hear you on the, it's not like you can take this tiny little bit of the current waste stream, right? And it's wonderful. And I don't think anyone has asked yet. So how can we support your growing industry, like your model? So actually I have two questions. One, should we all go out and buy polyester? and two, how can we support Circ and other organizations like yours? How can we lobby or encourage business to support appropriate policies that support the recycling?
So don't rush out and buy polyester.
I like that answer. Actually, I really like that answer.
The reason why I say this is because virgin polyester is made from oil, and oil is sequestered carbon. It's buried under the ground. And if you're using virgin polyester, you're bringing carbon up from where it's buried and trapped and putting it into circulation. So please don't do that. It's so, but the other thing is, to the extent that as possible, you can buy things that are more monomaterial. That's good. That you can go and help people make design choices. Like if you are designers, design with end of life in mind, because that is really helpful. And, as companies come online, the more the materials are standardized so that they can actually just all go into recycling, the better, because then your future, that the waste stream will be easier to process. So that's one of the things that I would say. In terms of policy and things like that, this is about supporting, as I said, vote green, lobby green, because textiles is one example, but it's not the only example. Mm-hmm. The other thing is actually just be more conscious in what you buy, because realizing that you will pay a bit of a premium for quality, but funnily enough, showing that people are willing to pay a premium for quality and for more sustainable options actually supports the industry. Because the problem is everyone talks about how they want to, be more sustainable. We get a lot of this about Gen Z and, they want to be more environmentally friendly. Yet Shein was the #1 downloaded app last year, across Europe and the US. And they have grown from like 100 million garments. They went from like 100,000 garments to like, 800 million garments in 5 years. People are voting with their wallets. Mm-hmm. And they're telling us that for a large number of people, sustainability is a far distant fourth, fifth, sixth in terms of how they make their decisions.
And how do we combat that, Lou? How do we combat a culture of consumerism? Because I think even that has to sort of work alongside all of these interventions and course correction that we're trying to do with the industry. But it's like this cultural imperative for more that is, fueling a lot of this. And are there groups that are trying to tackle this? Do we have a chance of winning this war on the culture front?
The only way is you drive systemic change like this is if we as parents, I speak to myself as a parent, help educate our kids to not to resist. And it's difficult. Like, it's really difficult to not buy your kids things that they want. But explain to them why. Like, my kids are really upset that I don't really allow birthday balloons, right? But it's a single-use item that's super polluting. We stay near the ocean. I normally live in Florida. I'm like, this kills turtles. So I have a hard time like buying things like that for my kids. But it's a really difficult discussion because balloons bring so much joy to my kids. Like, my kids absolutely love balloons. It's one of their favorite things. And I'm like, I'm depriving my kids of balloons. But, so being that change is difficult. And it's not, remember, this is a multi-generational thing it's built up over time. Reversing it is going to take time as well. It's not going to be, you can't just like change people's consumption habits overnight.
Anne-Marie?
Hi. Luke, can you talk about any like future technology that could help with this problem?
Sorry, it's really difficult to hear you.
Yeah, could you talk about any technology that could be helpful with this issue?
With which issue? With the textile recycling issue?
Yes.
So there are different technologies that are being developed in different parts of the process. So there's a lot of sorting and collection technology, which allows you to have a purer waste stream so that you can recycle it. There are recycling technologies like ours that are being developed to actually be able to bring these back for reuse. There's also a hierarchy here. So we talk about chemical recycling because we break down the polymers to recover them. But, your first stage could potentially be mechanical recycling, which is, less energy intensive, less chemically intensive, all of these things. So, there are developments happening now in mechanical recycling as well, then chemical recycling, then also a lot about data tracking and tracing technology, so what's in materials. Because the more chemicals and the more dyes and the more finishing chemistries you add to textiles, you need to know what's actually in there, because that again makes it easier to recycle.
Looks like Emily, you have your hand up to ask a question.
Emily?
Sorry. Luke, I appreciate this. I have so many questions. I think you were referring to the European regulations earlier. Do you feel like some of those regulations might actually push textiles to be exported and landfilled by other countries, as opposed to European countries actually taking action, whether that's in their design and in their, textile processes?
They're actually blocking a lot of that as well. So you can't just export the waste. They're thinking about this pretty aggressively and holistically. So will there be unintended consequences? Almost certainly. There always are. But are they trying to think about those and avoid them? Yes, most certainly they are. So
that is
it
very
is
good to hear.
they're thinking about actively.
I think sort of secondary and sort of to the conversations that you've been having, how are there good avenues of education around textile recycling, right? Like this is, I think, the first time that I've learned more about textile recycling. I've learned some about plastics recycling and how much of that actually ends up in the landfills. And I guess, are there good avenues to sort of get the word out so that people better understand of how to consume in a better way?
I'm just trying to think of any that stand out. I'd have to give that some thought and maybe get a list to you guys with some of the resources. I would look at projects like Good on You. I would look at groups like Reverse Resources. I would look at Fashion for Good. Fashion for Good publishes a lot of stuff in the space, accelerating circularity. But as a consumer and direct access and making it digestible, let me think about some of those. I mean, we are working to start doing more of that, where we will actually take a more active voice, but it's resource intensive actually.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Miranda, you're on mute. Oh, we can't hear you.
No, it's not. Maybe you're not on mute. Maybe your microphone's not active.
Connected.
Okay, let's see. Hang on. Can you hear me now?
Oh, there.
Okay, perfect. So, going back to the cost of this, I'm an avid thrift shopper because I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and rent's not cheap here. And I think that's something that a lot of millennials from my generation and, a lot of people live paycheck to paycheck. Do you, with thrift shopping, I shop at Goodwill a lot. It's right down the street. It's really easy, accessible. Is that a good practice to continue doing? Is this a way that we can kind of do it on the budget, but also try to extend the life of things? Because Goodwill's problematic. There's a lot of things about it that are bad, but they're also everywhere.
No, so hell no. You're misunderstanding me. Buy from Goodwill.
Okay, good.
That's one of the best things you can do.
Good.
I actually support them as an incredible organization. I think they do great work. And actually, any thrift store that you're going to and buying clothes from that, you can get some pretty top quality clothes because, it hurts me, but I'll find things that still have the tags on there in some of these thrift stores because people are like, oh, I bought it, but I never got around to wearing it. Now I'm cleaning it out because I've been watching Marie Kondo and, but so no, not only is it good for your budget, it is incredibly good for the environment. So
good. I'm glad to hear that.
I buy a lot of my clothes secondhand. Yeah. I encourage everyone to do so. I literally and I work with some of the most sustainable brands in the world, and the people at those brands are telling me to buy their clothes secondhand. And a lot of them are starting to do it, like Patagonia, they're like, hey, we're doing worn wear. And, they go extreme. They'll repair anyone's clothes. If you need a zip replaced and you're struggling with it, go and take it to a Patagonia store if there's one near you, and they'll do it.
That's awesome. I had no idea that was a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the other thing is we don't repair our clothes anymore.
Yeah.
I tried. I failed epically.
That used to be a skill. That used to be.
No, but it used to be a skill that everyone had,
mending, mending, repair. But to that question, building on Miranda's question around thrift stores, I've noticed in the last 5 years, the number of fast fashion brands that are dominating, the available offerings in thrift stores. So if we're buying Shein or Zara from a secondhand store, are we doing better, or is it just delaying, how we contribute to this problem?
No, I think so. One of the biggest challenges there, and maybe taking it back a step, is that's one of the problems that Goodwill and other thrift stores are having is that the stuff that's coming in is of poorer and poorer quality, so it wears out a lot faster. And also people have started, with the rise of thrifting and people are realizing the value of some of that secondhand clothing. And so what they're doing is they're trading it instead on other markets, right? So less high quality stuff is coming in through Goodwill. You used to be able to find amazing finds there. Now it's more rare. But I mean, it doesn't matter what you buy there. You're giving it a second life.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Anne in the chat asked if there were alternatives to throwing away textiles in places like Europe and Massachusetts.
So to a large degree, most textiles that get thrown away like that, if they are forced to do something with it, it goes into what's called shoddy fiber. It goes into like acoustic paneling, insulation. It goes into car seats. So there are moving blankets are all made of this sort of stuff. There are fewer alternatives. A lot of the of alternatives are not actually fully scaled, and there's just so much volume. So in parallel to the regulation that they're pushing for in Europe, for example, Europe is investing really aggressively in technology to actually process the textiles. So, you've got a lot of people ordering mechanical recycling systems. You've got a lot of people, when we announced our last round of funding, one of our investors is actually Inditex. So that's Zara, and when we announced that, several European governments, trade agencies reached out to find out if we would put our first facility in Europe instead of the US. They're that aggressive, and they offer great incentives. The US will hopefully catch up, but it's the places that are thinking about this are trying to incentivize people to then come and solve the problem for them.
And what do those incentives look like? Is it access to, is it tax write-offs? Is it or tax credits?
It's direct access to capital, actually. Like they will lend you money at really low interest rates or zero interest rates to fund your project to get it up and running in their area. And when you're building a large industrial facility that maybe 400 million to build, 500 million to build, it's not, if you've got someone willing to lend you 70% of that at interest free, that's a big incentive.
Yeah. And for Circ, where are you looking to locate your manufacturing plants?
We are evaluating sites at the moment, and we're evaluating both Europe and the US.
Okay. Can you say where in the US you're considering?
In the US, primarily, we'd be looking at the old textile corridors, which are in sort of the Carolinas, that sort of area.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense to be there because that's where you can access some of the still existing fashion assets and textile assets. In Europe, there's maybe Italy or Spain, or even just outside of Europe, mainland Europe is Turkey. Turkey is the fourth largest exporter of textiles in the world. So, it becomes, it's one of our most challenging problems is figuring that out, because you've got to have access to the right waste streams. It's got to be financeable. You've got to have, you don't want to be shipping your products then around the world. Otherwise you're creating a huge environmental footprint again. So you want to be close to, yarn producers. So these are all big things that you got to consider, but then equally you got to think about energy and access to resources and things like that. Whereas like in Europe with the war with Russia and Ukraine, energy prices in some places have tripled. quadrupled. I mean, think about that just on a business perspective, but think about also what that would do to your household budget if your electricity bill quadrupled next month.
Yeah. Any other questions? And another question for Luke?
Yeah, you've been really generous with sharing your personal story with your children. I can totally relate to that. As a mom of teenagers, boy, that's where a lot of this consumer push definitely comes from. But I haven't heard what got you interested in this story. What was the path that you took to end up learning the chemistry of a t-shirt, for goodness sakes?
Yeah, and Luke has a finance background, so it's interesting that
So
you
this was completely accidental. I decided I was sick and tired of my current career advising banks on financial risk. And I decided to quit that, go and take a career change MBA. I was in Oxford. One of the speakers was the former boss of a friend of mine. And he said, I've just invested in this company. Can you come and look at some spreadsheets? So I came across to the US to look at some spreadsheets. And that was quite some time ago. But the other thing that happened then was we were actually not in textiles at all. We were a tobacco company. Now, hold on, wait, before that you get the immediate reaction where you're like, tobacco. No, we had actually developed a non-smoking tobacco for use in producing green chemicals for industry. So sugars, oils, etc., to replace corn and soy, replace food crops with a non-food crop to produce these green chemicals. We then had to develop an extraction technology to get the chemicals out of the plants. And it turned out that extraction technology was the most valuable part of our technology, because it turned out no one wanted to move off corn or soy. And we were looking at what else we could do. And someone asked if we could test, textiles. And we did, but having been burnt so badly before, we were like, does anyone care? Because we got positive results. We were like, does anyone care? Is this even an issue? Or, and it just so happened that we made this discovery around the time that Ellen MacArthur report came out. And so we could actually, we Googled up and reached out to people, and we were like, hey, we can do this. And they're like, wait, what? And then turned out it was actually a big issue. But if it hadn't been for timing, like if we had discovered this 10 years ago, we might never have ended up in this industry, because there just wouldn't have been enough industry interest. It's crazy, but it happens like that. So that's how I ended up in textiles and fashion, is just not through any logical or linear path. This was not a carefully chosen plan.
Isn't that always the case? Any other questions for Luke? Well, Luke, I cannot thank you enough for your time and for your very candid, honest recount of what we're facing and how you yourself personally and professionally in your affiliation and role at Circ are trying to battle this most crucial and important issue in our world. And I am walking away with some very wonderful wisdom. I wrote down here, less wasteful, more careful, thinking about how to improve our sustainability profile in all aspects of life, not just textiles. That's something that I'm going to sit with and evaluate in my own life. And I'm also walking away understanding the three cycles of textiles, the industrial phase, the pre-consumer phase, and post-consumer. I mean, that was mind-blowing to me. So a lot of good information. And most importantly, everyone, vote green. Vote green. Vote green.
I cannot stress that enough. Ian, we need to have our voice, and we need it to be heard.
Yes.
So
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And thank you for all of you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Miranda to close us out.
Yes, thank you so much, Luke and Heather, for this. This was amazing. I definitely wrote down a few things as well, like always wash your clothes before wearing them. It's a little disturbing to think about really what goes into how your clothes are made. And it really does make you want to be a little more careful about how you choose your items for sure. I also want to say thank you to Sustainable Fashion Week for joining us and presenting this conversation. And I know Tanjuria is here and she would like to say a few words about Sustainable Fashion Week. We would love to hear from you.
Good evening, everybody. This has been amazing. Thank you, Luke and Heather, for having this conversation tonight. Atlanta Sustainable Fashion Week was created for the very reason to make people more aware of designers and clothing brands that are committed to getting to a zero net carbon emissions footprint, a place where you can find clothing that are clean and healthy for you to wear. So this conversation is very near and dear to my heart. But we also get there by having these conversations and by the education of learning how we can do our small part in contributing to doing better in our lives. So I want to thank you all applaud yourselves for being here and for heeding the call to do something different to help our environment be better. Thank you, Laura, as well and Moda for hosting us and hosting this conversation. So that's all. I hope everyone have a good evening and a happy Thanksgiving. I am here if anyone has any questions about Atlanta Sustainable Fashion Week, but I just want to thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Tanjuria, and thank you for helping us put this on for sure. I'm also very grateful to you, our audience, for joining us this evening. And if there are things you really enjoyed about this conversation and you want to hear more, I'd love for you to get involved. You can attend other events or become a member and join a community of change makers who believe that design can change the world. You can explore everything that's coming up on the My Moda portal on our Moda website. And I hope everyone has a happy Thanksgiving. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. This was a very wonderful conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.